Shri Kapil Sibal, Minister of Communication, Information Technology, Law, and I'm not sure how many other portfolios. Sanjay Joshi, Virat, Raja Mohan. Thank you for that very flattering introduction, which I don't deserve, but I'll accept it anyway. And thank you especially for asking me to speak here today at this conference, which is deals with a subject which is really important and topical. I think the quality and the nature of the participation that you have here is proof of the wisdom of your choice. And it also shows, I think, the increasing recognition of the partnership that cybersecurity and cyber governance require to be effective across the whole range of sectors. Now, to tell an audience like this about cybersecurity, the threats we face, or the risks that we encounter every day would be to preach to the converted. So what I thought I would do instead was maybe to mention briefly what we are trying to do in the Government of India to enhance cybersecurity, and then to make a few general points about international cyber governance. India, as Virat just reminded us, has a very large number of internet users. We have over 850 million mobile phones out there, and an increasing number of them are smartphones. But there are peculiarities, I think, to the domain in India at least. And one is, of course, that apart from the numbers, many of our major socioeconomic programs are delivered on IP-based networks. Government and private sector networks are intimately interlinked, probably to a very much higher degree than in many other places. And while overall levels of interconnectivity may be low in per capita terms compared to advanced economies, the sheer numbers of those involved and the criticality of what depends on our IP networks actually makes their protection imperative. The consequences of manipulation, of distortion, of attacks can be potentially disastrous even at our present levels of interconnectivity. And so to think of what might happen as we get more and more connected, and as that happens so rapidly, is worrying. We've had instances in the past. In 2012, we saw how one successful attempt at panicking people through rumors and so on the internet actually moved several thousands of people away from their normal places of stay and work. We like to think that we've managed to deal successfully with several attempts at disruption, with several attacks, but of course, that's hardly something that we can remain satisfied with. We don't know what we don't know, one. The danger remains from the undiscovered attacks and several others in the future. The challenge here, as we've just been reminded, is, as in the rest of the world, finding the practices and policies that enable us to protect networks and cyberspace while enabling the free flow and access to information that is essential to a democratic society. Now, the Government of India is very strongly committed to preserving the democratic nature of cyberspace, which in fact is one of its most attractive and enduring features, and to protecting the privacy of individuals while securing cyberspace for trusted e-commerce, security of data, and protection of critical information infrastructure. I think our citizens have a right to expect a safe and secure cyberspace from government, industry, and all the stakeholders involved. So the National Cybersecurity Policy and Framework approved by the government earlier this year adopts an integrated approach with a series of policy, legal, technical, and administrative steps to construct a multi-layered approach and a clear delineation of functional responsibilities among stakeholders. Coordination and the real-time sharing of information, of course, will be the key to success in its implementation. It also seeks to strengthen the element of trust, to strengthen the assurance and the certification frameworks which address supply chain vulnerabilities, hardened networks. It also tries to encourage R&D in cybersecurity and capacity building in the field. One of the keystones of this is, of course, the protection of critical information infrastructure. The Information Technology Act 2000 defines critical information infrastructure in the broadest possible terms. I quote, it says, the computer resource, the incapacitation or destruction of which shall have debilitating impact on national security, the economy, public health, or safety. Now, this is a very broad definition, and as our CIIs get increasingly interconnected, interdependent, complex, and distributed, we have seen a phenomenal increase in the number of attacks on them. Certain tells me, and is happy to share the figures with the public. We are in the process of notifying the CIIs under the IT Act, and a National Critical Information Protection Center is being set up. And in the meantime, the National Crisis Management Plan has already identified 9 sectors for us to protect. In defense, energy, finance, space, ICT, I&B, public essential services and utilities, law enforcement, and security. But we realize that this is not something that government can do on its own because of the nature of the domain, because, as I said, of the interconnections that we work with. And this is why we have tried to actively partner with industry associations, with service providers, with other stakeholders, in joint efforts to secure cyberspace. We have several joint working groups established with representatives of government departments and the private sector, and we're now looking at setting up information sharing and analysis centers and testing and certification laboratories in the private sector by industry, and centers of excellence for capacity building in various areas, including policy research, setting standards, and so on. India has recently obtained authorizing nation status under the CCRA regime for IT products. And testing labs in the country will now gain global recognition. This is an opportunity for industry to actually invest in product testing and certification facilities in India. And DEITY's standardization testing and quality certification can now be a certification body and accredit private testing labs to operate the certification scheme. There's been gratifying interest on the part of industry in setting these up. And it's our hope that with the progressive increase in manufacturing in India, CC test labs will also become increasingly viable. In the meantime, we will be accepting reputed international certification while our own testing and certification facilities are being established. But naturally, given the global and the multinational nature of ICT operations, it's not viable for each country to prescribe its own standards, safety standards, security standards in isolation. And this would ultimately raise the cost of service, affect interoperability, and hence the imperative need for international cooperation on these aspects, especially on standards, on evaluation methodologies, and so on. Of course, every country has the sovereign right and duty to prescribe certification assurance procedures and to satisfy itself as to the adequacy of the standards that they are being respected. But it cannot do this in isolation, as you all know. So we've tried to play an active role in international efforts in the UN group of governmental experts in evolving international norms of responsible state behavior. Our basic approach is to support democratic and representative internet governance while preserving the strengths that come from the open nature of the domain, keeping interference to the minimum required to keep it socially responsible and legal. The institutions that are invested with the authority to manage or to regulate the internet should be broad-based and institutionalized so as to be able to take on board the concerns and views of all stakeholders. Because the internet is effectively a global commons. It cannot be managed only as private property. Its governance and its architecture need to reflect this fact. Take, for instance, the allocation of generic top-level domains. Decisions on applications for domains such as .indians or .ram or .buddha and so on, which have sensitivity, naturally need to take into account those national, those cultural sensitivities. And we also need to find ways of making that possible. How we secure private freedoms while preventing misuse of the internet, how we strike the balance between the open democratic nature of the internet and its management by a few and still fulfill the demands of cybersecurity is probably the great challenge of our times. There's a tendency to posit a false dichotomy or an antagonism between free speech and privacy on the one hand and security in cyberspace on the other. If cyberspace is a global commons, as it seems reasonable to assume, there can be no absolute rights or obligations in that domain. The issue really is how much and the nature of the regulation that we can agree among all the stakeholders. In India, all that government and its agencies do in cyberspace, whether it's monitoring or data protection or regulation, is governed by law, by the Indian Telegraph Act, by the Information Technology Act. And these laws, in India at least, do not distinguish between Indians and foreigners. This is not the first time in history that we face issues like this. With other new and potentially disruptive technologies which rapidly become indispensable and ubiquitous. When aircraft, when radio, when wireless first began to be used, we heard the same arguments about controlling them, limiting them, monitoring them, about international safeguards against their misuse. What we ended up with was completely different from what was so passionately advocated by each of those who participated in the argument at the beginning. And that is the stage we really are at now with cyberspace and cybersecurity. And I'm sure it won't be very different with ICT in the future. So I look forward very much to learning of your discussions over the next few days and to seeing the results, because I think it will be a big step forward in showing us how we can deal with these fundamental issues in securing cyberspace. Thank you, and I wish you every success in your discussions.